Hi, Run. Welcome to another episode of the Global Trade Show. I'm your host, Lawrence Christoffels. On today's episodes, I'm joined by not one, but two Bryans, two experts in international trade in their own right. And, really excited to have them on the show because there's so much going on with global trade, global business, that wanted to invite them along. I'll kick off with Bryan Goldberg, who's a trademark expert. So, Bryan, always great to talk to you. Thanks for joining me on the show.
Thanks for having me. And timing is good because there is a bit happening in the trademark
Absolutely.
world.
Well, that's why I thought I'll introduce Bryan Clark first, and I'll come back to you, Bryan Goldberg. So, Bryan Clark from a CT and a great industry expert and trade expert in your own right. Bryan, thanks for joining me on the show as well.
Thanks, Lawrence. And yes, we're always very good to talk to you. I'm certain this will be as interesting as ever.
Thanks, mate. All right, so Bryan Goldberg, give us an update. As you just said on the opener, there's a lot going on with IP around the world, and with so many things going on in global trade, IP is probably just another important one that companies need to navigate. You had some recent insights and visits. Tell us a bit about those.
Sure. Well, the big one is the US tariffs. And even though they're Australia's great ally and we sell a lot of product and services to them, for the first time in a long while, everyone or all my clients have had to open their eyes and say, well, what if we can't sell to the US anymore? What happens? Where do we look? Do we give up? And whilst we always glance then to the other side of the world, being the UK as our default loyalist, it is a long way away. Yeah. So perhaps the potential of Southeast Asia has come to the forefront of Australian businesses and entrepreneurs to look and more closely to Australia and say, well, maybe we should focus here and pay more attention. Even though that's been out there for a while, I think this could be a turning point.
Yeah, so true. And from an intellectual property perspective, does that mean so many of these companies would be exposed in those other markets?
Exactly. So with trademarks in particular, that's my focus, and brands. Now that traditionally people would have products and they'd go to a trade fair and then pick the countries that bought product and we would protect their brand. But in this modern digital world, you've got a website, you're selling online, you've got social media, you are exposed. But if you're not heading to the market or the country jurisdiction, you're not really fussed. But now that you're looking elsewhere at different markets, you have to make sure pretty quickly that your brand for your products is available. And so that when you can get into that market, you get in there quickly and properly and aligned with your current branding rather than have to rebrand.
Wow. Well, I'm sure you're probably already started to get very busy with all these inquiries and navigating your clients' needs around some of these new and emerging markets as well. Bryan Clark, if I can bring you in here, what's your take on, has this ever happened before? Is this unprecedented, the sort of major changes in global trade?
No would be the answer to that, but not for a long time. And not at the scale, I guess, that we're talking about. You see individual countries, act in particular ways, but the United States is obviously a fairly dominant market. And then beyond that, you've got the retaliatory responses from some other countries, like that China has done to the United States in fairly much matching the tariff which is being applied in the way that it's being applied. So you've got some interesting dynamics going on. It's a little hard to know what the end game is meant to be for all of these things, but there are also spin-offs, the second round, both losses and benefits that go with that too. And because China can't trade effectively with the United States anymore, the same applies. The United States can't trade with China effectively, and that's opening up opportunities in China, but it will also mean Chinese products are going to other locations too. And so nations are then concerned also about dumping activities, and there's a whole range of things which are cascading from this. But in the end, the global rules-based order is under threat. And the WTO, which has only existed in its current form since 1995, hasn't really ever developed beyond what was the original GATT system. And it had the failure of the Doha round. It's never had anything else go on particularly. It did have the Trade Facilitation Agreement, which is a landmark agreement, but it's not spoken of a lot. And then most recently, we had the joint statement initiative led by Australia and some other countries on e-commerce, and that's also very important, but doesn't seem to get the recognition that it might. And then we have, a lot of interesting conversation going on around bilateral or regional agreements, but they also risk heading in the direction of breaking away from that global rules-based order into trading blocks or something else. And we have seen all of that before, and it hasn't been the best way, that the world should go. And so we'll see where this ends up. But there is a risk that it could end really badly.
Wow. Yeah, it's look, in always in times of uncertainty, there's great opportunity, but yeah, you need to have your finger on the pulse and be agile enough, I suppose, as an importer and exporter to be able to navigate that. And so, Bryan Goldberg, to what Bryan Clark just said, I think these type of understandings for an importer or an exporter, especially around the intellectual property, some of the trade regulations, it's my view that most, and I generalise here, most Australian companies are probably not mature enough or understand the complexities of these type of nuances. What's your take on, let's say, that sort of maturity or experience in these type of navigating some of these different regulations and rules, and even from an IP perspective, how to protect yourself or how to leverage and maximise?
I agree with you up until about 3 years ago. And then the digital marketplace has exposed so many Australian entrepreneurs to the global markets that they're now quite savvy in knowing international markets are for them. It's digital, it works. They know how to navigate their way through the system. And when you're launching a company here, Australia might be your first company and you might need to move offshore. So I'm very impressed with the leading entrepreneurs and their knowledge and their foresight, but that's only a small minority. The majority of companies are probably reactive. And the challenge is that even if you listen to me today and you filed your trademark in India, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, Thailand, it can take a year before it's registered. And in those countries, they're very strict that unless you own the brand, you can't use it, you don't have rights. So you do need to open your eyes, in my view, right now and look where your products or services might be and start the process.
What you've just reminded me of a question that's commonly asked, and I know, like, I always think of you when someone says this, is how do I use IP? And I remember once you told me the differentiation about first to market or first to register. For our viewers, could you just, I know that's a simple one for you, but could you just sort of refresh people's mind about those two differences?
Yes, thank you. So in Australia, we're a first to use market where you get branding rights under common law for usage. So Australians were never jumping at filing trademarks and spending money when they had some rights. But in most jurisdictions, it's a first to file. The date of the application gives you the right over the next application that's similar. However, in addition, in the Asian markets where I'm saying have a look and explore, paperwork, ownership, certificates, authority of ownership, all those documents are needed for every process. Wow. So having exactly first in with the trademark application, not necessarily to market, and then getting it certified and registered will ensure that the rest of the business flow is a lot smoother than it would be if you try to do it without.
Great, thanks, mate. It's always one that I think so many people are unaware of, and they probably don't understand how those differences can be so powerful in each market and expose themselves because they're used to here in Australia. Yeah.
Thanks for raising that. Yes.
Oh, great. Bryan Clark, now you're based in Canberra. We've just had the election. I'm going to ask you two things. What can the Australian government do to help Australian importers and exporters navigate all this uncertainty? And two, if there was if you're in charge, what are the type of things that you'd love to see negotiated with some of the FTAs that have been taking a while?
So there's a couple of ways to answer this, Lawrence, but the first one is there's very little governments can do which is going to be offering short-term relief to the industry. If the current interest in tariffs, particularly in the United States, is going to stay over the term of the Trump presidency, because we don't know what will happen after that, but that's 4 years old, or 4 years away. And renegotiation, although we've just seen the UK deal, and very interestingly, it's a very few pages apparently. So the scant on detail, and compared to a normal trade agreement, and supposedly the detail is yet to come. Well, we'll have to work out what that is. But the traditional way of negotiating things is very detailed, usually an all-in arrangement that means that bits can't be traded off against each other. You can't do a little bit here and then a little bit there ordinarily. And so it'll be interesting to see where these supposed US deals go and what's the corollary of them. Again, the British one seems to be fairly narrow, and they're going to retain the 10% tariff, threshold tariffs into the United States coming in, but with some relief for certain products, automotive, steel, etc., and supposedly in return for some greater access for United States product into Britain. Well, I'm certain the Australian government will be looking very closely at, well, what's that deal? Because we'd be pretty interested in some agricultural market access into the UK and, in fact, Europe for the European deal. So the negotiators watch all of these things and see what the positioning is, and obviously want something better than somebody else has got. But it brings me back to the WTO, is all of these things are preferential. The way you get the preference with the bilateral agreements is then through rules of origin. And we don't know really what the United States is thinking about with its rules of origin, but they will also be complex, you could imagine, and there are means to effect protectionism. You say that you're liberalizing, but you're not liberalizing a supply chain which has got China at the end of it, or Russia or somewhere else. So it will be interesting to see where all of these things are. So people need to watch that. But businesses, the thing the government can affect really quickly is the costs of doing business. And that is the cost that the Australian government imposes on the supply chain. And the Australian governments, or the Australian supply chains, are known to be amongst the world's most expensive. And so the process, even just to get it from point of production to the border in Australia, is very expensive. The process of getting it out of Australia, also, depending on what you're talking about, might have some certification, might have some fees and other things associated with it, let alone what the other countries are doing. But we're in charge of that. Yeah. And the government, hopefully what we've got now is stability inside the government. So one of the outcomes from the election is that not a lot will change. The ALP may be more bold, or willing to be more reformist than they have been before, let's hope. But one of the things they could really do is dramatically improve Australia's cross-border trading arrangements that are within the control of the Australian government, and we'll see where that goes. But the other thing to just remember is Australia has a floating exchange rate. And so while, the tariffs work in one sense, flows of money work in the opposite direction, really. And so the floating exchange rate to some extent will also provide a buffer. So as different economic circumstances are prevailing, you will see adjustments going on in the exchange rate, and they can, reduce or, possibly even negate the impact of the tariffs themselves. But just remember all of that administrative burden which is going with it.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Bryan. Just to wrap up, I'm mindful of the time, and it's been great to have both of you on. So as a final question to you both, what would be sort of some hot industry sectors that Australia can take advantage of some of these latest changes? Is it in the agri sector? Is it the resources, mets? I don't know. I mean, just throwing it out there. And to Bryan Goldberg, are you seeing any peaks or declines in certain registration areas or verticals as well? So just sort of those two questions to close out today's show. I'll start with you, Bryan Goldberg, if you like.
Sure. The one answer is India.
India, okay.
To manufacture things in India, where it's always good to have a trademark when you manufacture. The quality seems to have gone up. The interest has gone up. the relationship between Australia and India seems strong based on cricket and other aspects. And the lack of enthusiasm for China has led that India's manufacturing. And then as we cross that, especially in sport and cricket, a bit of my world,
Yeah.
the Australian-Indian relationships are very strong, which leads to more business activity.
Yeah, lovely. Thanks. I mean, I know that there was the UK have just signed another FTA with India only earlier this week. So other countries are obviously seeing the same sort of opportunity as China becomes more complicated. Then they're looking at India as an alternative very quickly. Bryan Clark, do you want to wrap us up and give us your thoughts on some of those things around the verticals, markets, or basically is there any sort of observations or tips and advice to close out the show?
Well, something which I like to inject into some of these conversations, Lawrence, is everyone wants to support exports and talk about exports. The other side of that is imports. And so, Australia also, there's many opportunities, of course, for Australian businesses, but the challenge for them is you can't flip-flop around between markets. If your common market was in the United States or in China, you're going to stay with that because you've got reliable customers you're trying to deal with and then work out the cost structures for that. But the import side is very important as well. And so Australia could really be a beneficiary with cheaper products. Depending on what we're doing, we've got cost of living crisis, you've got cost of construction crisis. Those goods that might be affected, we may see them lower in prices, and that will be a good thing and available in Australia. But the corollary of that is the competition effect, and so it impacts the businesses which are in Australia and trying to do things. So we've got to really look to the sectors where Australia is globally competitive and back those. And you let the market do that. You don't pick winners. And on the other side, you want to make best advantage of the cheapest product you can get in the supply chain coming into the country, which will also be to our advantage.
Yeah, great advice and great summary. I think that hopefully that means I can buy some stuff cheaper at Bunnings, but and reduce some of the prices. That'll be good
For
fun.
your car.
Or the car, yeah, we'll go to Repco as well. So some free plugs there. But no, you're right. Hopefully the inbound stuff will be cheaper, but also the companies can take advantage of some other markets outside of the US. But look, I've really enjoyed, as always, talking to you both. Bryan with an I, Bryan with a Y. So always great to chat and love the expertise you bring to the show and to your clients and broader databases as well. So I'm sure I'll touch base with you both again very soon, and this year and the next couple of years looks like it's going to be really interesting. So thanks, gents. Look forward to speaking again soon and see you in another episode on the Global Trade Show.
Thanks, Lawrence.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Cheers.